Tell me, Martha, what shall I do about my love for you? Tell me, Martha, why I don't abandon all this. Why I don't just throw it back in your face.
You tell me, Walter.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Tess Hatch, who is the Vice President at Bessemer Venture Partners. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So before the start, I was just, talking about looking at your background that, there are very few people that know at a very early stage in their life in terms of what they wanted to focus on. But I got the sense that you had a kind of a love and focus around aeronautics, astronautics, and of course, the work that you're doing now in terms of deep tech and space. When did you know that this general area that you're in was going to be something that you really want to focus and to stay with it?
The 7 minutes of terror when Curiosity landed on Mars convinced me to study aerospace engineering and embark on this now deep passion for aerospace engineering. It was the summer before freshman year of undergrad. And I was at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California for the landing of the rover on Mars. It had just spent 6 months launching from Cape Canaveral in Florida, traveling to Mars. And due to the distance between Earth and Mars, it took 7 minutes of a delay for the transmission to get back to Earth, whether the rover landed successfully or not. And for those 7 minutes, you could hear Mission Control's heartbeat. Everybody had held their breath, hoping for a successful landing. And when the rover sent back a picture of its shadow on the Martian surface, that moment has stuck with me through years of many Falcon 9 and Electron from SpaceX and Rocket Lab launches and other exciting moments in the space industry. But that moment really convinced me to study aerospace engineering, which I did. I got my bachelor's in aerospace from the University of Michigan and my master's in aeroastro from Stanford, and had some work experience at SpaceX and Boeing. And now I invest in companies continuing to push the space ecosystem forward as an investor at Bessemer.
So, what's really inspiring about what you're sharing is that, we haven't had this kind of level of enthusiasm that you're talking about since the Kennedy era, really. And I feel like there is this kind of a new birth, new emergence and interest. And I think your story is not just unique to you, but it's actually has, pervasively affected millions of people around the world. So we are very much captivated by this new sector that is becoming privatized and commercialized. And the prior guest, he called it, space economy too, because he worked at a legacy company before. My next question for you is, I know you've also had hands-on experience. You've worked at Boeing as well as SpaceX, again, very different companies. So I'm curious to know, what did you learn and take away from those experiences, and how has that added a special, unique filter in terms of your optics as you consider your due diligence?
I got amazing experiences at both SpaceX and Boeing. At SpaceX, I learned all about integrating satellites with the Falcon 9 rocket, working in mission management. And at Boeing, I learned all about metal 3D printing, working as a structural engineer on a satellite platform. And both of those experiences were really phenomenal, really helped me gain a strong technical foundation in the industry. I actually worked at both of those companies right after my undergraduate degree. and took a break and went back to grad school. Maybe not necessarily a break. Grad school, I was getting a technical master's in aeronautics and astronautics. But during that technical degree, I really liked the customer facing or the business aspect of my work in mission management at SpaceX. So I wanted to complement that with a more business focused thread in my graduate studies. So I saw a fellowship for engineering students that were interested in leadership in business, and it was from the VC DFJ. And to share with you, I did not know what either of those acronyms, VC nor DFJ, meant. I knew DFJ was an early investor in SpaceX, where I'd just been working, so they must know what they're doing. But I didn't know what venture capital was, what it meant, and through the program, a partner at DFJ, now called Fresh Gold, Heidi Roizen, and a professor at Stanford, Tina Seelig, really explained to me that venture capital is an industry that instead of being a technical engineer at a single company, you can invest in the broader ecosystem. And that really resonated with me. As much as I love space and I love rockets and satellites and involved in those companies here at Bessemer, I also spend time in autonomous vehicles, in the future of food and agriculture technology, and robotic and sustainable fish farms, and all of these other deeply technical industries that now as an engineer I can contribute to.
So I wonder, going back to your experience at some of these larger aerospace prime companies, as well as the new ones, how has that given you a certain perspective in terms of how you consider startups? And I think sometimes within startups, it's kind of natural to have a certain degree of enthusiasm or can-do attitude, which tend to kind of overshadow, let's say, some of the realistic or even the gravity of practical execution aspects, as well as the complexities and the risk and just the time frame that really takes to execute certain aspects.
I think the invention of the Cubesat, so a tissue box size satellite that was the result of decades of Moore's law exponentially decreasing the size and increasing the power of commercial off-the-shelf electronics, allowed for this new form factor in space, really lowering the barrier of entry to space, but also perhaps distinguishing between old space and new space. Old space were these massive school bus sized satellites that would take years, if not decades, to design, build, test, and launch, and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And the invention of the CubeSat changed this 36,000 kilometer school bus sized satellite orbit to a tissue box whizzing around the Earth every 90 minutes in low Earth orbit, which is 500 to 1,200 kilometers. It's where our International Space Station is, if you saw the movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock and George Clooney. And I think the invention of that form factor really opened engineers, entrepreneurs, students' imaginations to all of the things, all of the types of sensors one can put on this CubeSat. And it's really quickened the feedback loop. So getting your asset into space doesn't take as much time. It's decreased the cost. It's no longer tens or hundreds of millions. It's as low as a couple $100,000. And it's really shifted it's really opened the ability for everybody to contribute to space, for space really to be a common theme in everybody's lives.
So one of the questions that I have is, I think just in the last couple of weeks alone, I've looked at about 8 satellite companies that's focusing on hyperspectra and metaspectra. And so the question I have is, from an individual firm level, again, I completely understand where they're coming from, but at an industry building perspective, are you concerned about having too much redundancy? And then, of course, the externality that comes with having these tissue boxes up in space, if they're not properly handled in terms of decommissioning and the end of life?
So I'm going to break your question into two. There's great ones. The latter one was the space debris issue, which I actually just wrote an article on TechCrunch about this topic. So I have lots of thoughts. Regarding the first one on hyperspectral, specifically imaging CubeSats, the two primary sensors people have thought to put on a CubeSat are Earth observation cameras, where it could just be a passive camera or an active camera, like a synthetic aperture radar or a hyperspectral imaging, like you mentioned, which is a chemical, a way of taking an image with a chemical reaction. And the other sensor is comms or communications, which we've all heard of SpaceX's Starlink or Amazon Kuiper, which are trying to launch tens or hundreds of thousands of satellites in space for ubiquitous internet connectivity to provide the entire world with latent and tolerant communication and connectivity. I am really interested in investing in unique or novel sensors that really aren't those two. I think those two have amazing companies that are going about those and will be successful. But I really look forward to partnering with an entrepreneur with a unique or utilizing a unique novel sensor in low Earth orbit. For example, I really appreciate a company my firm Bessemer has invested in that I serve on the board of called Spire Global. And we have three pretty unique sensors. We have a AIS sensor for maritime tracking, an ADS-B sensor for aviation tracking, and then a GPS radial occultation sensor for weather monitoring and prediction. Weather, aviation, maritime. I mean, these are three really important industries and can benefit from space situational awareness. Now to space debris, which I worked on a project with a group of brilliant Stanford students on interviewing experts in the field. And it's really interesting because either people think it is a critical issue that we need to solve yesterday that is going to pollute our skies and cause big clusters of junk and make space unusable. Or the other camp is it's not really a problem, it'll solve itself, and space is large. Space is really large. We have enough space in space, pun intended. And it was interesting from these conversations with these experts in the industry that right now things are tracked to like 10 centimeters. Leo Labs has the capability to go down to 2 centimeters. And a lot of them do have, like you mentioned, some sort of deorbiting mechanism, whether it's propulsion or a way to get out of its orbit and then it burns up upon reentry. And the lifespan of these CubeSats, at least 500 kilometers, is only 3 to 5 years. If you go up to 1,200 kilometers, it exponentially increases the lifespan of the device or the satellite. So right now, it's not the largest problem, but if Starlink, if Kuiper, if a handful of these mega constellations do launch, it absolutely will be. So the advice or the conclusion we got to at the end of this article and the end of this research is we'd love for these companies to self-regulate. We'd love for all of these satellites to have deorbiting capability and propulsion to get out of the way of others. We'd love them to invest in better tracking down to less than 2 centimeters and really working together. It's space over all of our countries and all of our worlds. Now, with time, we know regulation will be necessary, and we really urge and hope that the regulators will work closely with technology and the companies that are working in LEO to make regulation that is up to date with how quickly technology is evolving and moving. So that's a really, I think, exciting future and potential for low Earth orbit to continue to be open. I really do think space is going to continue to open for business.
I think that's a really sound and a reasonable conclusion. And one of the things on the regulatory side is how, we've seen the transfer of ownership from essentially a division within the Air Force handling the collision and avoidance over to now the Department of Commerce, for instance. And there are, I think, a lot of learning and ramp up. But to your point, any thoughts around how do we help those regulators and those in charge to create the right framework and create the right incentive structure or even penalties so that, satellite companies are more incented to self-regulate?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and great question. I think first, companies should want to do this themselves. There's they should have, what if we had some sort of scorecard that contributes or you're judged based off how environmentally friendly you are to space debris. For example, Rocket Lab, a company my firm also, Bessemer Venture Partners, has invested in, and we've launched 17 rockets deploying nearly 100 satellites in space. Leftover rocket parts is the number one contributor to space debris. So we didn't want to contribute to that problem. We were relanding, refurbishing, and reusing our first stage. And then our kick stage, which is the second stage that's used to place the satellite in its exact orbit, we flip it around and then deorbit it, and it burns up upon reentry. We do not leave any space debris in space because we acknowledge in the future this will be an issue and we don't want to contribute to it. So if there was some sort of like scorecard that Rocket Lab and these other companies can get in regards to its contribution to space debris, that would be interesting. That would be one way to hold them accountable. And regulatory entities and regulatory bodies can utilize this. I think another interesting, we called them stakeholders that we mentioned. Obvious stakeholders are the satellite companies, the rocket companies. An interesting one that isn't as obvious is insurance, the insurance players. If they have and got more information on space debris and the reliability of that satellite not colliding with something else and being able to insure that satellite, there's now an economic incentive that's put in place. So there's other players in this ecosystem. Another one I forgot to mention is the end user, the person getting the data from the satellite. They could have a lot of input here to make sure that our space stays clean and safe.
I agree. I absolutely agree with you. And I think the stakeholder composition is very diverse. And generally, I think we're starting to be more cognizant of some of these externalities. I wanted to switch gears and talk a little bit from the perspective of an investor. When you look at the current state of the commercial space, what is the reality from an investor point of view? What are the real risks? And how do investors, as well as LPs or even retail investors for that matter, that participate in some other vehicles, how should they navigate these potential time frame as well as risk that's inherent?
I think actually space is becoming less risky. It's becoming more common. I think in May of this year, when SpaceX launched Dragon Crew with astronauts Doug and Bob to the International Space Station, I mean, it really excited the public again. It also was the first time in nearly a decade we launched American astronauts on an American-made private rocket on American soil. And they're now safely home, which is very exciting. From an investor perspective, and to answer your question directly on what are the considerations? Yes, I mean, space it has a longer feedback cycle, takes a little bit more time to design, build, test, and launch your satellite into space than it does changing a line of code and pushing it into the ether like most software companies. And it takes more money, it takes more capital. Ultimately, from a Bessemer investor standpoint, we put our hardware companies to the same ROI, return on investment thresholds, and within the same time as our SaaS software companies. And they really do meet those milestones. I think something, though, however, that is holding the space industry back is the lack of liquidity events. Mm-hmm. There have not been a ton of exits in the commercial space industry, while there are hundreds in SaaS software and cybersecurity and consumer, you name your other industry that venture investors focus on. I can name a handful. Google acquired Skybox in 2014 for $500 million. Virgin Galactic went public via SPAC, actually end of 2019, which now there are a handful of other space companies that have SPAC'd in the past month or two, which I really hope this year changes that lack of liquidity in the past. And it already has started to, and I really look forward to it continuing to do so that I don't have that reason as a reason that the industry is being held back. That there are many, many paths for space companies to exit, whether it is acquisitions or becoming a publicly traded company on some exchange.
I think I can agree with you more on that. And the question there is certainly we do, have some good examples of launch companies, but when you look across the different subcategories within space, Do you feel like there's enough inventory, not just in terms of really early stage, but inventory of more mature, those that are, closer to 1 to 3 years before they can actually experience that SPAC or IPO or acquisition?
You're asking about, let's say, Series B or C stage companies, or earlier or later?
Series B through, let's say, even D. Yes.
I was recently on a panel at the Satellite Innovation Conference, I believe. Usually it's at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. And our moderator, Dara, had a really interesting statistic that I'm going to approximate because I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was the number of C deals was up significantly. It was up a lot. Series A was up 20%. B was significant, but then like C or D was up 5x. So it was really interesting seeing seeing the data, seeing the trend of more difficulty in funding around the Series A and the 5x at a Series D. So it's interesting. It's money in the space industry is going in really early or really late. And there is this middle ground that I think is a little bit more difficult for space companies to raise capital at the Series A or B stage. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where the difficulty is. And usually that's correlated with the time it takes for that satellite company to get their asset in space, which is to start generating their product and therefore revenue.
Correct.
And therefore, I urge space companies as soon as possible to get that flight heritage, to launch something up there. When I was in grad school, I launched a Cubesat in a few quarters. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. It definitely is rocket science, but I really urge entrepreneurs as quickly as possible to start getting your assets up there. And with the launch companies that we've been talking about, and with the space infrastructure that's been established, it's definitely available and accessible at the moment.
That's the same exact conversation that we just had in our prior interview with a space startup, and it's this notion of trying to get their particular sensor or chip into space as quickly as possible, piggybacking on what's going to ISS, other machines, other devices that's going up. And I think you're right. It's that flight heritage, and this notion that it doesn't have to be perfect, because to your point earlier is, unlike the old space economy where everything had to be hardened for radiation and extreme temperature changes, these things are only good for 3 to 5 years, and the technology changes so rapidly that you need to get things up there, even if it's not completely perfect, right?
Did you study aerospace? I was that was spot on.
No, I did not. I studied economics. So for the remainder of the conversation that we're having, I want to ask you, because you also cover other sectors such as AV, food, ag tech, and other deep tech categories. Can you talk about areas that you're excited and why?
The 3 areas I'm most excited about after commercial space are drones, autonomous vehicles, and the future of food technology. I will touch on each of those briefly, starting with drones. I absolutely imagine a future where if someone were to have, unfortunately, a heart attack or an allergic reaction, it takes an ambulance on average 14 minutes to get to that person, when a drone can be dispatched and deliver an EpiPen or an AED device, saving that person's life within minutes. And I absolutely look forward to the day where a drone delivers me my late night takeout, my pizza via drone package delivery. Before that, though, there are dozens, hundreds of uses for drones, whether it's inspecting agriculture, construction, energy, oil pipeline, train tracks. I mean, there's so many use cases for drones that I think are really exciting. So I've been spending a lot of time and have invested in a handful of companies in that ecosystem. The second one, autonomous vehicles. I think we all are excited for the future where we don't have to drive our car and it picks us up and autonomously takes us to our end destination. And then I'll spend a little bit more time on the third, which is the future of food technology. And I'm specifically interested in companies using novel processes or ingredients to exactly mimic the end result. We have all heard of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods that have really catalyzed this industry in replicating beef with plants. But imagine all of the other things that can be mimicked without harm to animals, without as much of an environmental impact. I've made investments in a molecular coffee company, a company that is using stems and roots and seeds and nuts in a special chemical reaction to exactly mimic coffee called Atomo, based in Seattle, and a plant-based lamb company, Black Sheep Foods, that's similar to Beyond or Impossible, is using plants to exactly mimic the taste, texture experience, the cooking experience of lamb. So I'm really excited, especially this year, in spending a lot of time in a variety of end results that are just created in a different way than they have been.
Super. We have time for just one more question, which is we always ask is lessons learned, whether it's from your operational side or whether it's from your investing side. Any kind of lessons learned that you want to share with others?
That is a great question. And as I was listening to a lot of your other podcasts, I especially enjoyed the answer from the speakers on this one. I think the biggest lesson learned personally, if I may, is work and play don't need to be in series, and that they can be in parallel. So I feel like at times in my life, I have really doubled down and have just spent all of my time working or all of my time playing. And work-life balance is really important. And ideally, you'll find a career or a path where those sort of interchange, which I feel like with my job now, getting to go to rocket launches and play with drones and test autonomous vehicles or various plant-based lamb is definitely playing and working.
Amazing. So with that, I've been joined by Tess Hatch, who is the Vice President of Bessemer Venture Partners. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.